We want to thank you for joining us, and today is a little bit of a special edition. For some of you that tune into the podcast on a regular basis, Brian does look familiar. You might know who Brian is a little bit, but I'd still love for you, for those that don't know you, to introduce yourself and what your role is right now.
Sure. My name is Brian Johanson, new to Erie within the last year, and took on the role of CEO of the Erie City Mission back November last year.
Yeah, so we're coming up on a year, which is exciting, and it's been a very good year and an eventful year, but that's not necessarily the capacity that you're here today for, and we are in the boardroom at the mission, and so thank you for being gracious enough to open this space up for us to record today. And this is not the purpose either of why you're on, although you are a lifelong Steeler fan. The NFL kicked off this week.
Well, I should say that I'm not a lifelong Steeler fan. I married into it.
Yeah, you married in.
So I married a girl from Pittsburgh, and my father-in-law said, if you ever want to eat in this house, you better be cheering for the Steelers. So that's how it became about 40 years ago.
Yes.
So
that was about 45 years ago. Basically, when I was born, that was kind of the deal in my house growing up with my parents. You know, being from Washington D.C., it was being a Redskins, now Commanders fan.
Right.
You know, from the start, and so we've been long suffering. Yesterday was not much better, but you guys got a win. You're the only one in the AFC North that got the win.
Six field goals.
Yes.
But hey, whatever it takes.
Exactly. Might not have been offensively impressive, but it was enough.
Yeah.
And a win is a win. So with that being kicked off, obviously we know the time of year coming up, and this week is September 11th will be Wednesday. And so this will air on September 12th.
Okay.
And so we wanted to take the opportunity to talk through September 11th and remember a little bit, because you offered before to help in that conversation, because your recollection is very, very different in your involvement. I know we were talking before we hit record, like so many people I know of an older generation, like my parents have always said, I know exactly where I was when JFK was assassinated, when that announcement came on.
Right.
And for me and a lot of others, we remember exactly where we were when we found out the first plane had hit.
Right.
And then for a lot of us, I know for me, like it was, I had heard about the first plane hit, and I was watching the news with my dad. We were off work that day, 23 years ago, which is crazy.
Wow.
And I remember we were standing in our living room, both standing, because we didn't usually watch the morning news or anything, but because of everything that was going on, and we saw the second plane hit live. And I just remember standing there and just all the thoughts that rushed through my head, and like, man, this is different, and what is going on, and what's going to happen. But I was in Fairview, Pennsylvania.
Right.
And so those that know your story a little bit remember that you grew up in New York City.
I did.
And so on September 11th, 2001, where were you? What were you doing? And what was that like for you?
Yeah, so just really quick, from New York, born in Queens, lived in Manhattan, and was in the construction management world after grad school in the high rises in Manhattan, and then felt the call to work with the Bowery Mission, which is a old historic large Bowery Mission, which is 12 blocks from Ground Zero.
Yeah.
So I went to work for them back in '93, and so stayed there for 21 years. But it was on 9/11 that day. I was actually not at the mission. I was kind of commuting in, and I remember the subways had stopped, and the bridges were closed, and the tunnels were closed, and so we ended up coming up out and walking across the bridge, 59th Street Bridge, and then walking all the way down 2nd Avenue to to the Mission, which was below Houston Street. So if you know New York, there's a divide between Old New York and kind of where the first, second, third streets go all the way up to Central Park. So Houston is that divide, and so below Houston, they had by noon, late afternoon, they had blocked off Houston Street with Humvees, and it became ID only coming in because that was, the zone of what had happened.
Yeah.
And so I had gone for the training to become a chaplain with the state of New York and with working with the police department and the fire department. So I had a badge, and so that was easy to kind of navigate through the different checkpoints to get down to the Mission. And so that's how I ended up at the Mission hours later because there was nothing going that way.
Yeah. Were you, when the planes actually hit, were you still underground on the subway?
Yeah, I was actually home.
Okay.
And getting ready to leave. And so then when I went out, I came out and ended up trying to go down the subway, but they weren't running.
Okay.
So I ended up walking across the bridge with everyone else, but everyone else was going the other direction.
Yeah,
and
everyone
so
else was getting out.
It was, so I was actually home when the first one hit, and then I was kind of commuting in as the second one hit and had to change the plans to get down there.
Now, what, and not in a pat yourself on the back way of any kind, but it would have been very understandable for you to stay at home.
Yeah.
When you didn't know what was happening and all that. What led you? What was the prompting? Was there a conversation with Gigi, your wife, of like, yeah, I know something's going on. I'm not staying home. I got to go.
Well, it's funny.
What did that look like?
Yeah, she's funny. She'll tell you that, God was looking out for me in that if I had been, because often I would stay overnight at the Mission.
Yeah.
And we had a little apartment there, and so there's often times when I would stay overnight, and if I had been there, I probably would have gone to our local precinct and gotten involved earlier on, and I don't know what would have happened. Yeah. And so my wife's like, well, I think that was God protecting you, that you weren't going that way. But, for me, the Mission was a priority, and so it was in that zone, 12 blocks from the ground zero, and I was the director. Yeah. So I needed to kind of get there, and cell phones went down for a while and different things, so I had some communication with what was going on down there, and the word was, you need to get down here, and so I did my best to get that down there, down to the Mission.
Yeah. And as you got down there, what was that like? You talked about getting through security. You had your police badge as a chaplain, and we'll talk about that a lot, coming forward. But what was it like getting down there? What, if you can think back, what was going through your head?
Well, you see a lot of pictures. A lot of people's references is what they see on TV and those pictures of people kind of walking covered in dust and debris. Yeah. So the path north out of that area walks past the Mission. So it's right on Bowery, which actually turns into 3rd Avenue when it goes above Houston Street. So the Bowery was one of those routes that people were kind of finding their way out of that area, out of lower Manhattan. Yeah. So what I saw was a lot of people kind of trying to find their way, like, where am I? Find their way north. Yeah. The Mission has a beautiful old chapel, large chapel, almost a cathedral with stained glass, and just a really beautiful old chapel, historic. And the doors were wide open, and my team had already gotten water out. They were giving out water, and people were coming into the chapel. And I remember this this feeling of the end of the world kind of desperation of people who would just kind of come in the chapel to gather their thoughts because this is crazy, and a lot of crying and a lot of praying and a lot of because it seemed like the end of the world, like how could this happen? And so people were shaken, and so they were wandering in. Some of them came in the chapel just to sit down and rest, and it's a large chapel, holds hundreds and hundreds, and so I can't say there were 100 people there, but there was some people sitting in there, all covered in debris, trying to make sense out of it, and very kind of a end of the world kind of feel for a lot of them.
Yeah, and sometimes when you're not in a situation, you don't realize, like, this wasn't like a movie. Yeah. This wasn't, and you mentioned something earlier that I think is very telling. My recollection of 9/11 is what I saw on TV.
Yeah.
But man, there was a reality and humanity to that I didn't experience.
Yeah.
And so absolutely it would make sense that people that were in the heart of it just trying to get their wits about them and the world is ending, what is going on, and
that's what was happening. And the team, so our staff and residents at the mission, which was a large staff, had taken it upon themselves to give out water and pray with people and just kind of be a comfort because, in the day after that, again, no one knew how many people had passed. I mean, the number of 10,000 was being thrown around. I remember the first and second day, and nobody really knew. And people were still trying to reach their loved ones and all of that kind of stuff, and people asking to use the phone because cell service was sketchy, and the trade centers were a hub for a lot of that, those antennas and so on. So there was a real crisis of communication for a lot of folks, and the staff tell me that they went up on the roof of the mission and actually got to see the second plane hit and see it fall. I was not there when that happened, but they said they were, because it was a clear day, the weather was good, sun was out, and they were able to see the second plane hit and fall.
Yeah, man, that's a whole different thought process of what September 11th would bring back. For those that were actually down there.
Yeah.
But even for you, who eventually was down there, you weren't that far. I mean, from where you and Gigi lived at the time, where you were traveling and commuting in, you could see the World Trade Centers.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I was to say, so it's not like you were a couple hours outside of New York City, with a huge commute.
Yeah. So I think we were about a mile. So the mission, I would say, was a country mile from where the ground zero was. So it sounds like a lot, but it's like 12 city blocks.
Yeah.
And, kind of catty corner to so you could see it. I mean, the World Trade Center, since I was a kid, was part of the skyline growing up. I mean, it was just, you saw it as you drove or wherever you were. It was kind of a landmark. I've been up in the World Trade Center as a kid, and looked out the big windows and all of that. It was a very, if I could describe the feeling that day, it was very kind of end of the world, kind of like the world's coming to an end kind of feel. And what was interesting was people in the chapel were kind of had this feeling of, let me get right with God almost, because I don't know what's happening here.
Yeah.
Is there a nuclear bomb? Is this what's going on? And it was that traumatic for people that were there and saw it.
Absolutely. I mean, there was, I remember even here, there were a lot of questions of what's next, because there was the third plane in Somerset, Pennsylvania.
Yep.
And so then it was like, how far does this plan go? Like, there was a legitimate fear, and just, the stupid things you remember. That was release day, so that 23 years ago, they still had CDs come out, on Tuesdays.
Right.
And so it was, like, I always remember it was a Tuesday because there was an album that was coming out that my brother and I really wanted. We couldn't wait. Right when he was done with school, he was going to have football practice. I was going to go to practice. And then after practice, we were going to the mall to get the album, one of those, like, little things you remember. And we still went through with it to try to have some normalcy. But, man, we got to the mall and it was a ghost town.
Wow.
And there was just this eerie feeling of, what's going on? I don't think we had the end of the world feeling necessarily, that those that were right in the heart of all of it.
Yeah.
But I remember it was just very, very different.
Yeah.
And it was, just so somber and just trying to figure it all out. And then when something like that happens, you get stuck in this, when you're a distance away, you get stuck in this, all I'm going to do is watch the news to try to figure out what is happening.
Right.
As you're in the heart of it, though, I mean, maybe there was a combination, you were watching the news, but you had the actual people coming into your mission.
Yeah.
So what was that like, to come up with a plan? I know you were talking about, praying with people and handing out water.
Yeah.
But did you when you got there, did you rally the troops as far as the staff and, like, this is our plan, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to be flexible because we're not sure what's coming?
Yeah. So in the days and weeks following the event, the Bowery Mission became a big part of the recovery of what was happening. And so we were providing food for workers. We were sending staff down. I was down in the pit there with other folks, and it was there was a real plan on the part of the Bowery to really be a support to what was happening. Our chapel, that same chapel that had taken care of those people the day of, became the storage place for all the medical things that were being donated to New York. So in the weeks and months after 9/11, everyone in the country kind of was a New Yorker, right? So,
absolutely.
So they were and so people are very generous, and so a lot of donations came into New York from around the country. And so the city had taken up this system of kind of sorting that on a large scale, and medical and type equipment, breathe masks and all that kind of stuff got directed to the Bowery, and it went into our chapel, and it was just massive amounts of equipment. And then Javits Center became like all the water and food and all these different things. So they did their best. I think the city shined during that time. I mean, Mayor Giuliani was a real leader during that time, and I didn't know that police commissioner very well. I got to know the next police commissioner very well, but the fire chief, I mean, they actually all came down to the Bowery about a couple weeks later and actually thanked the Bowery staff, and I have some pictures with them, and they gave me a little award a couple of years later for what the Bowery did in partnering with what happened down in Ground Zero. And but it was did we make a plan? I think we were just part of the plan, and I think there was just a lot going on. And I remember our trucks were bringing food down and trying to help, but it was chaos. I mean, I remember driving the truck, or one of our staff, we were all in the truck bringing food over to the West Side Highway, which we were on the east side. And I remember seeing the tractor trailers driving out all the cars and the fire trucks and
Yeah.
the steel. So they just had a convoy that was nonstop of taking stuff out. And I remember sitting there at that light watching them go by, like, wow,
Yeah.
that's like serious, like, like a smushed fire truck,
Yeah.
and a smushed cars, and just going through and that happened for months after
Absolutely.
it was happening. So
Yeah, there was so much wreckage,
yeah,
that needed to come. Obviously, the buildings alone
Yeah.
were a mass amount, but you forget just how much damage there was of
Yeah.
everything around it,
yeah,
as well, and taking that out. So you talked about also the fact that you had gone through the training and
Yep.
you were a chaplain
Yep.
for the police department.
yeah, working with the police department. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was based out of the 5th precinct, which is
Okay.
the precinct on 6th Street, 7th Street up. It's actually the same precinct. If you ever saw the show NYPD Blue back
Yeah.
in the day.
Yeah.
So they always show the front of the precinct, like in the opening credits, and that was the one actually that I worked with.
Oh, so you were NYPD Blues chaplain?
Well,
not for the show, but
not
yeah.
for the show, but and they, so there was a lot of things that needed to happen. So they had the 23rd Street Armory, which is up on 23rd Street, not far from Bellevue Hospital, which is
Okay.
where and NYU, where the medical examiner's office was. And a lot of the remains would go to that hospital for identification. And then a few blocks west of that was the armory. So it's a full city block that's had like a military purpose. It stored massive. It stored military equipment, things like that. And that's the one that when you look at the pictures when you see pictures of that day, you saw the people posting or taping pictures of their loved ones on the fence.
Yeah.
So that's the fence that went around the armory.
Okay.
And it's because that had become the kind of family information center.
Yeah.
So like I said, no one really knew how many people had died. I mean, honestly, no one knew. I mean, it turned out to be 3,000, but nobody knew. Numbers were being thrown around of no one knew, 10,000.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there were still a lot of people that were like, where is my dad? Or where's my husband? Or where's my wife?
Yeah.
And so people were coming to that center. And so one of the jobs of the chaplains was to be available to kind of help people through that process. And, the list would come down every day of who had been found and who had been identified, and people would just be milling around outside, hundreds and hundreds of people on the street, just kind of waiting for news.
Yeah.
They didn't know what else to do, so they couldn't go down and
Yeah.
look in the rubble, so they posted pictures of their loved ones on that fence with a number. If you've seen this person, and
Please call.
that's where they were. And so I remember vividly the scene of a little boy, Indian boy, walking around, probably 10, and walking around with a picture and saying, have you seen my dad? And I remember that this was I don't know whatever happened with him or his dad, but I remember that. I don't know if he found him or I don't know, but people just didn't know where their loved ones were for a long time.
Yeah, and something like that sticks with you.
Yeah, I remember that, and I remember the anxiety of that moment of kind of the roller coaster of a little hope, and then it sets in again that it's been 3 weeks and we haven't found them. So and it's just a very unique situation.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the things that a lot of the chaplains did. And then some of my colleagues were also doing, anytime they found a remain in the pit, people don't realize that they would stop what they were doing. That's why it took so long. And all the construction workers would stop, and a chaplain would come in, and they would perform some rites and say some words, and the construction workers would take their hats off. And it was kind of an event every day, multiple times a day, as they were finding remains of people.
Yeah.
And that was meaningful, I think, for a lot.
For sure.
And then participating in a lot of. I mean, they had 300 police and fire funerals in the course of a couple months, and was at many of them, and what I felt was so meaningful was that every single one of those was the same. So it wasn't like, let's do, well, this is, just this guy, but everybody got the same treatment, such as they would block off both ends of the street of the church, wherever it was, in Brooklyn or Queens or Manhattan or New Jersey, wherever they were.
Yeah.
And they would put 2 fire trucks, ladders up, and hang a flag at the end of the street.
So that wasn't just for the
Everyone.
higher ranking officers.
Everyone.
Yeah.
And then there would be this procession and the bagpipes and the whole thing.
Yeah.
And, the mayor and the team, to his credit, made it to a lot of them, and there was a real respect, which was very meaningful because of the chaos around. It meant there was some real stability there. I think that offered a lot of stability to people.
Yeah.
And meaningful that everybody got the same treatment.
Absolutely, because I'm trying to think if I was a family member of, for a lack of a better way to say it, someone who wasn't ranked as high, someone who was just the run-of-the-mill police officer or firefighter that lost their life, that would mean a lot that they were treated in that manner after, paying the sacrifice of losing their life, to answer that call. And so that is neat to see. As you were talking through, were you ever one of the chaplains that were at Ground Zero with remains?
I was not.
Okay.
I've been in Ground Zero. I was in the pit. You were down there. We were more up in the family. Had to still keep the mission running.
I was going to say there was also your full-time job.
But I think being part of that was where we were assigned or where we were working. And, I saw the funerals take place in the pit, but there's a lot of people really helping, and
absolutely,
and it went on for months and months and months.
Yeah,
it wasn't just a day or two thing.
Did you have any interaction with either a chaplain that helped deal with it, or maybe you helped deal with those that were like, so the chaplains were eventually giving care to the rescue workers. What about the construction workers? I can't imagine what that would have been like to go to a job that normally is do your work, put your head down. Yeah, there's teamwork, but not much human interaction.
Yeah.
To all of a sudden, we're moving all of this stuff and finding people who had passed their remains, and we're the only attenders to their funeral. Like, I got to imagine that was traumatic for a lot of them, and something they weren't used to or expecting. And, none of the people that did all of the work signed up for it. Like, nobody was expecting that to happen.
Sure.
But did you have any interaction?
They were a lot of them union guys, so union steel workers and union, which, they're a special breed.
Oh, yeah.
And, have a lot of respect for them. And I agree with you. I've never thought about it that way, but I agree with you that I think, that's an emotional. Not everybody in their daily job finds a body or
Yeah.
remains, So I'm sure, to answer your question, I'm sure that there were folks, that there were crisis counseling centers all around
Yeah.
that they could
Mm-hmm.
be part
That
of.
they could
I'm
have.
sure the union provided some stuff for them. And a lot of them, 10, 20 years later, got sick because of their work
Yeah.
down there. That's a whole nother issue.
Yeah.
But a lot of them breathed in a lot of crap,
Yep.
and it affected them down the road. So yeah, they get a lot of credit. I just and it and a lot of the ministries that were involved in working with supporting what was happening down
Mm-hmm.
there. I mean, I know the mission was one of them, but there were many, many that supported the work that was going on.
Yeah, that really stepped up.
Yep, yep. And you know, it's something that's because I have a little wall in my office upstairs that
Uh-huh.
actually has a little kind of a remembrance wall of some pictures of me with some guys and the mayor, and some pictures I took of the actual ground of the pit, and
Hmm.
the flag that was flying over the mission on the day it happened. And those are
Yeah.
meaningful things to me, maybe not to
Absolutely.
everyone else, but to me they were meaningful, and I've always kept them. And I try to watch the service online every year where they read all the names, and
Yeah.
it's just meaningful. It's interesting that you see people reading the names who were children when it happened and now are 30,
Yep.
or 25,
Yeah.
and never really knew their dad or mom.
Yeah.
And to see them up there reading the names. I was very close to some who died.
Hmm.
So a couple that come to mind. One was name was Paul Gill. He was a firefighter,
Hmm.
and my wife and I, during in our young days, were youth pastors at the church there
Yeah.
in New York, in the
That
inner
your
city.
dad pastored.
My dad
Yeah.
pastored, and so this was an inner city rough
Yep.
youth group of about 100
Yeah.
kids, and Paul was one of them.
Oh
And
man.
Paul grew up to become a firefighter,
Huh.
and died on that day.
Yeah.
And so I've been to Ground Zero and seen his name, and knew him very well.
Yeah.
And another guy who actually almost died was a guy named Lieutenant LaRocca, who was a lieutenant at the firehouse not far from the mission, and we got to know him through the mission. And he tells the story of rushing down there with his team after the first one hit,
Yeah.
and being assigned to go into the second one and lead out people out of the second one. And he tells the story. I mean, it gives chills in your back, where he comes in, and if you had been in the World Trade Center, the lobbies were both identical, huge, I don't know, 150-foot ceilings with these giant pillars all
Yeah.
around with glass. That was
Mm-hmm.
the lobbies. And he says he came in, and it hit as soon as his team came into the lobby. And he remembers going over to one of the columns and holding on to the column as a firefighter. And this is a big guy.
Yeah.
So this is a big guy, and he holds on, and he says he remembers surviving that, but yet most of the guys that he went in with, he saw them get flattened like 10 feet from him. And he tells the story, emotionally about
Absolutely.
being spared and holding on to that column, and it's only a miracle that he
Yeah.
wasn't killed as well. And I knew Lieutenant LaRocca well, and he's retired now, but he definitely was there when it happened.
Yeah.
And his a lot of his squad was killed in front of him. Yeah.
And that's it's a both and of tragic and just the trauma of seeing all that, but then so impactful, like you said, telling the story of why he was spared, and just knowing that his life was spared.
Yep.
And
Dramatically.
And yeah. Like as you stated, literally as those around him were falling.
True story.
And the sovereignty of God and the protection, and his plan. We don't always understand why maybe we were spared or someone wasn't, but for him to, walk through and feel both of those feelings simultaneously and move forward had to definitely be a process for him.
Yeah, for sure.
And so as you had the opportunity in the days to follow, the weeks and the months to follow, because like you said, this was not a quick get back to life. Like,
they had the blockade there for months after. People weren't allowed down, and it was a military zone for a long time.
How did you, in the midst of it, there's the practical way of you were the hands and feet of Jesus by serving. But at one of the things that I've appreciated so much in getting to know you and having your leadership here at the mission is the first and foremost is this is God's mission.
Amen.
And it's the gospel that needs to go forward.
Amen.
And that's the healing power that people need.
Amen.
Might not be what they're seeking. How did that keep at the forefront, and what did that look like for you to, because at the core of you, that's one of your values and virtues. It's not just a job responsibility you have.
Correct.
Like that is at the core of who you are as a follower of Christ.
Right.
And so what did that look like in the moment of, hearing the prompting of the Holy Spirit of not just in deed, but in word, sharing the gospel?
It's a great question. I've said a couple times that in doing these interviews in the past that New York City really was at a crossroads. So this tragedy and trauma happened, and for a couple months after, there really was this feeling you could feel in New York of, let me get right with God.
Yeah.
There really was that.
Yeah.
I felt it as a New Yorker, I felt like people were seeking answers, right? So there's this, why did this happen? What can we learn from this? And let me get right with God, and so on and so forth. I definitely felt that. Pastors will tell you that.
Yeah.
That churches started to fill up, and people were seeking answers, right?
Yeah.
Well, what I felt happened was, like 6 months after this tragedy, there was this spirit of New York kind of pulling itself up by its bootstraps, and New York strong, and which is fine. I don't have a problem with any of that.
Yeah.
But it overshadowed, I think, the experience that people missed out on, and that there was we're going to rebuild, and we're going to, and which is tremendous. Fine. I mean, it's wonderful that there was that spirit. But I just kind of feel the city missed a bit of an opportunity, a God-given kind of outcome that could have come out of that, which was almost a revival, if you will, of coming back to Jesus.
Yeah.
And yet it morphed into more of a self-reliance as opposed to a seeking God for the answers. And I'm sure a lot of people recommitted their lives to the Lord or got, accepted Jesus. But I think the city missed an opportunity, a country maybe even.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way that out of that tragedy, out of that could have come something beautiful like a revival.
Yeah.
For our nation, and I don't think it happened.
Yeah, there was definitely a different sense of people, even nationally, seeking, because things like that happen and questions arise.
That's right.
and what is, like from the meaning of life and all this stuff. And ironically, the album that my brother and I were going to get got really popular in mainstream, but it was a Christian like metalcore band named POD.
Okay.
Stands for Payable on Death. And like they were having the album come out, and their first single was really big, and then their second single really spoke to the just everything that was going on. And it was a song that was written before, and at that time, like MTV had this Total Request Live, and like the videos would get play by being requested, and their song Alive, which was the first single, it did great. Well, then their second single was called Youth of the Nation, and talking about just all of the struggles the youth were going through, and it was a little bit of a slower song, and that one really took them off. But there was this overall, even in mainstream media, there was this searching, and I remember the host at the time would talk about faith, on MTV of all things, and like how there was the opportunity to search out a higher calling, and then everything just kind of, like you said, it faded quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and it got replaced with a kind of a self-reliance, I believe.
Yeah.
Which, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think the opportunity for revival and chance for people to get right with God was a little bit missed.
Yeah. On the other hand, though, on an individual, smaller scale of what you experienced, were you able to have more meaningful conversations with individuals at the mission, you and your staff?
Yeah,
People were obviously more receptive to talk about the gospel.
Well, they're all New Yorkers too, so
Absolutely.
they're trying to make sense of it, and so they're processing it, and yet they got to turn around and still be compassionate to the people. I mean, the homeless and drug addicted didn't go away, so they still need to be fed, they still need to be loved, they still need to be challenged. So here you have a staff that needs to be cared for and supported, and some of them lost loved ones in 9/11. So it's a very intertwined with a lot of that. Very close knit. A lot of folks, and everybody kind of knew somebody who was involved in it. And if not passed away. So there was a lot of conversations, and I remember some really deep chapels that we had. I mean, we had a chapel every day at the mission before a meal that was voluntary, and we'd have a couple hundred in that chapel. I mean, 300-400 in the chapel for our meal before the chapel, and here's people that are not only struggling in their personal life, now they're in a city that's falling apart. Yeah. And so, what am I doing? Where are we going? So, there was a lot of counsel and a lot of support given, especially to our staff who were on the front lines of not only helping at Ground Zero, but also serving the folks that we were called to serve.
For sure. So you talked about you have the reminders in your office, and which is a great thing, and you try to watch the service online.
I do.
The reading of the names every year. Are there any other things that, when it comes around this time, that you're reminded of that are good for you to be reminded of? I don't know if that makes sense, but are there things that when it comes to around September 11th are almost positive triggers, to help you recenter if you've gotten off path a little bit,
That's a good question. My wife knows that when 9/11 comes around, I'll be watching that service online, and I have a couple of buddies still in New York that are former police officers, and there's always a call or two, and kind of a we had a tradition for a while there where my guys and I would get together at a certain pub and have a Guinness.
Yeah.
I'm not there anymore, but I know that it just was a big part of a lot of people's lives. It's hard to describe.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do have a lot of memories that you don't think about all year long, and yet,
For sure.
boom, then you start seeing the stuff on TV, and you start people. I've watched all the documentaries and all the stuff.
Yeah.
And there's a wonderful. They've done a beautiful job at Ground Zero of building something that's very meaningful down there, and the museum that's there.
Yeah.
And if you haven't been there, I challenge folks to go and see that and remember. I think the country has done a good job of remembering. I've actually been to the one in Shanksville as well. I went there a couple of years ago while I was out here in Western PA and saw that. Saw the service there on 9/11. It's. I like the fact that people have continued to remember it, year after year.
Yeah, I know locally, Girard is one of the few VFWs that has never missed a year.
Yeah.
Since. And so when I was at Grace Girard, I had the privilege of doing either the opening or closing prayer for those years that I was there. And there would be a handful of people. I mean, more than a handful. There'd be, over 100 from the community, and the local high school's band would come and play some music, and they did a really good job of putting a service on and trying to remember and be reminded. I'm sure there's also, like you were talking about before, you're not there anymore with some of those guys, but maybe during this time of year you might reach out to them a little bit more. It's a reminder to touch base and check in on them, and see how they're doing.
It's funny growing up in New York City, the typical childhood experiences of running around the block and playing stickball, and you just had your little gang of kids that were getting in trouble, and that was my childhood. And a lot of those guys went on to be go and become civil servants, so they went on to become a fireman or a policeman or a garbage man or whatever. That was kind of the blue collar neighborhood that we grew up in, and so that was, and there was a definite respect, I think, back then for those professions. I mean, it was an honorable thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think 9/11 accentuated that it was a real honor to be in that calling in your life, to be in that profession. Sadly, I think in the last few years that has changed, sadly.
Yeah.
And but I do remember 9/11 giving a kind of a real kind of a respect to the military and to our civil servants of firemen and policemen. There was unfortunately it's gone a little differently now.
Yeah, and I think that we could, this is a totally different path, but sadly there is an elevation of every single thing that happens, and so we see things on media and think all interaction with police or firefighters are like that, and it's less now than ever statistically.
Correct.
It's still horrific, some of the things that happen.
Oh, no doubt.
But there's so many that give their life and serve so faithfully, and they truly are serving the public and putting their life on the line to do their job, and they do a great job. And to try to be reminded, like, we still need to have that level of respect and gratitude for those men and women that do that on a regular basis and do it well. I have a number of former athletes that I had the privilege of coaching that are in the police force. One that I had the privilege of officiating his wedding. He and his wife just came up, and I think he's going in year 7 or 8. And he's a local cop, not in Erie, but in a surrounding city. Mm-hmm. And, they came up and they let us know that they're expecting their second child and all this stuff. And I mean, knowing full well what he sees on a regular basis and having conversations of just talking through, how do I deal with this? How do I not bring this home? You know, like we've been in touch over the years, but to see him and so many others that, man, they serve very faithfully.
Yeah.
And they're doing it right.
Well, as a chaplain,
gratitude for them.
As a chaplain, I mean, I was a chaplain not only on those days. I mean, I was a chaplain for years before and after, and so I've been in, interrogation rooms, and I've been in cells where people tried to commit suicide, and this part of this, you get to understand what our officers, men and women, deal with on a day. They really deal with the underside of our society on a daily basis, and it becomes tiresome. It becomes jaded, and people, it's hard to see every day. And then you're talking to these men and these women, and they're processing stuff that they see every day. And not only 9/11, but even everyday stuff in New York.
For sure.
They're dealing with just the tragedies of everyday life, of child abuse and domestic violence and all these things that are horrific, and most of us don't have any contact with at all. I mean, we have blessed lives, peaceful lives, and yet these men and women choose to walk into that every day
and put themselves in harm's way.
Well, that, but also into the emotional and the kind of mental, because I think that's harder on a lot of our officers than it is actually the violence. I think they walk into someone's apartment where a woman's been beaten, where you can't recognize her, and you have to deal with this person, this man that's done that, and the kids, and that's like, wow, that's like, and you see that every day for 20 years, and I'm not. Yes, there are some. This is a whole other topic, maybe a whole other radio show. But from my understanding, this is just a real. Having been there and talked to these men, this is a very traumatic thing that they try to process every day, and I have so much respect for them and what they do every day. It's funny. I was in Erie the other day, and there was, during the festival, they had a car chase that actually smashed into the stage, that whole thing. And I was actually walking down the street that next day, and the whole thing was quarantined off. They had a police, it was like a crime scene, and there was one cop standing there, and I actually am so used to, I went and walked underneath the crime tape, and I'm walking, the guy's like, "You can't do that." I'm like, I guess I can't.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I went up, and we started talking for a while. He was a large, giant African-American guy. And we started talking about the job and, and so on, how long he had been on the job. And I told him I was from New York. And we had a really great conversation. And these are people. These are everyday people. They go to church. They have kids. They coach basketball. I mean, these are some of our outstanding citizens in our community. Yeah. And I have a real passion for loving them and making sure that they're recognized.
For sure. So. And I would definitely echo all of that. Yes, there are bad apples, but there are bad apples in every profession. We are sinful humans, but the vast majority are doing such an admirable job. And
day in and day out.
Yeah, day in and day out. And it is just, I guess my encouragement to people would be is get to know some police officers and firefighters, and like, if you don't know them, and actually just hear from them, and see what it is they go through and what they do on a regular basis. And the reality is it's all for us, the regular citizens' benefit, in the end. But so also a reminder for those listening to be praying for the first responders on a regular basis and lifting them up, because the world's not getting a to be a better place. Like
Correct.
this is not, this
Yeah.
is not going away. And
Yeah.
so to be mindful of that. Well, thank you so much
My
for
honor. My
talking
pleasure.
through this. Yeah. And I hope it does remind people of what just happened or what took place, and to not forget, and to be reminded of some of those things. I also remember at that time just how civil everyone was to each other, and we put our differences aside to be united for a season. And it's like, man, why does it take a tragedy to do that? And as we're coming to a time that's going to continue to be heightened and divided with this election, like, to be reminded to try to put some of that stuff aside,
Yeah.
and look for the common, the commonality you have with that other person, and try to go the other route and be countercultural and look for unity instead of division.
Yeah.
And I think that'd be great. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for the remembering of September 11th, and thank you so much, Brian, for your, sharing of your experience, and just how different it was than probably most, if not all, our listeners. That being in New York City, and just your experience there. Thank you for listening to the Federated Squared Circle, Wrestling with God's Word. We'll see you next week.